This is the Grow Your Clinic podcast from Clinic Mastery. We help progressive health professionals to lead inspired teams, transform client experiences, and build clinics for good. Now, it's time to grow your clinic.
Welcome back to another episode of the Grow Your Clinic podcast. My name is Jack O'Brien, your host, and I'm really excited that you're joining us for another episode today. We really appreciate you as a listener and part of our community, especially those that leave reviews, ratings, and friendly comments over on iTunes or Stitcher, Spotify, wherever else you listen. So thank you so much. Thank you for joining us today, because today's a really special episode. We have a returning guest, which, as I mentioned to her before we hit record, doesn't happen very often. She's one of the elite few. But I'll tell you what, I am really, really excited to welcome back to the podcast, Sarah Bartholomew. Sarah, how are you?
I'm very well. How are you?
Fantastic. So for those who are unfamiliar, Sarah is the founder, director, leader of YouLegal, the goddess of governance. She's a lawyer, goes about her law work in a really unique way, and we love working with YouLegal as one of our mastery partners. So Sarah, I've got a couple of icebreaker questions actually for you before we dive into it. So are you ready for those?
Hit me.
Okay. What are you reading or learning right now?
What am I reading or learning right now? I read voraciously.
Mm-hmm.
So I have been reading a book that was given to me by one of my landlords. So it's about the war, and I'm not really big on the war, but he said it was an important thing to read about. It's called Monash's Masterpiece. One of the reasons he said it was important to read about is I think Monash is on the $50 note.
Okay.
So it's by Peter Fitzsimons. I also read a lot of business stuff. So what am I reading business-wise? The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein, learning about shock marketing.
Mm-hmm.
Other ones, I usually have a few on the go, but I'm just looking at the books I've most recently read, because I like to keep a note. Building a Story brand is a recent one, which has been really good. I'm not sure if I found out about that on the webpage from you guys, or
maybe. The
Resilience Project is one. Having a couple of little kids and learning about how to make them resilient is really important to me. So, yeah, that's what I'm reading at the moment. I'm really interested in learning about brand as well at the moment from a business perspective, and creating something that people can relate to, and trying to make sure that we've never been a traditional law firm. We try to create that point of difference and have people relate to us like people. We want to humanize legal rather than have people think that we're robots or that we speak in a different language to them. So that's really important part of our brand, and getting people to understand that.
I love it. Brand is awesome. A couple of my favorites in there, the Story brand and the Resilience Project. Is fascinating. Okay. Question number 2, who inspires you?
I love Oprah.
Yeah.
Well, I met her a couple of years ago, and it was amazing to meet one of your inspirational leaders. What inspires me about her is that she started from nothing and from a difficult place, and she's just built this brand and herself at authentically being herself, and just being such a guiding light for so many people. I really knew, I watched a lot when I was in school, when I wasn't well, I had a sick day or whatever. She was a daytime show. And so I loved her from that, but just maintained. I love her podcast. So
good. Speaking of school, what did you want to be when you were growing up?
I wanted to be a journalist.
Okay. Why is that?
Well, I love writing. I've written 3 books, so it's probably not a huge surprise. I have a podcast as well, so I'm interested in communicating, and I think that's why. But then I didn't get in. When I went to uni, it was a super high mark that you had to get.
Really?
I think it's probably lucky now that I didn't get into journalism. It's changed so much over the past 20 years or so with the internet, and I've been able to use my interest in communication just through I got into arts and did an arts degree, and after my first year was getting marks that got me into law. So I did a double degree and thought that if I still wanted to be a journalist, they were still both very relevant degrees to have. And Annabelle Crabb, who's another inspiration of mine, is a graduate of Adelaide Uni Law School and has managed to have a career in journalism with those
so
two.
Good. Tell us, what is your podcast? Just give it a subtle plug.
Accountants on Purpose. So you guys inspired me at one of your conferences to start a podcast, and it's for accountants who are up and coming. And my first series I did actually with one of the Clinic Mastery partners is on it, Andy Wang. He works with allied health and health professionals. My first series is interviewing people who work with health professionals.
So good. So that's Accountants on Purpose. Can find it in iTunes and Spotify?
Yes, anywhere.
So good.
You listen to podcasts.
So you wanted to be a journalist growing up. And then the fourth question is, what's a motto that you like to live by?
What came to mind is one of Harvey Penny's, which is inspire before you expire. We act for clients who have a purpose that's higher than profit, which is why your tribe fits so well within what we do, because we find all health professionals always put other people before themselves, sometimes to their detriment. And working with people who help people inspires our team to know that they're doing something for a greater reason than just helping people out of arguments that aren't going to mean anything to anyone in the long run.
I love that. That's awesome. Thank you for sharing. And so in a similar vein to that, you and your team at U Legal help businesses and help a lot of health clinics get their stuff in order.
Yes.
So I want to focus a little bit today on what are some of the things, maybe documents, policies, what are the things that a health clinic needs in place to protect themselves?
So I've been thinking a lot about this lately, and especially for bigger clinics that have practice managers that might not have a legal background, we do find that it's a bit of a mystery area for people, and in the interest of humanising legal, explaining it for people is a really big part of what I do every week now. So I think about it in three ways, splitting your practice into three parts. And the first part is your practice. The second part is the people within that practice. And that includes your team, yourself, and your patients. And then the third part is profit. So the foundation piece for that isn't necessarily a document. It is making sure that you've got your right structure. And I've talked to a lot of Clinic Mastery peeps about having a structure in place. And if people aren't working with an accountant that usually works with health professionals who own their own practices, they might not have the right structure. So making sure you've got a legal structure in place that's going to protect you and give you an opportunity to maximize your profit as well is super important.
And so when you say structure, we're talking things like sole trader, partnership, companies, trusts.
Yes, that's a structure. And it will depend, like all things legal, it depends on what's right for you. And working with an accountant to get that right is important to make sure that it's maximized from a tax perspective.
Are there specific documents that people need in place in and around those structures? There
are. And I will get to those. And in fact, at the end, I will list all of the documents, if you think that's useful, for each of those areas, practice, people, and profit, so that you've got a comprehensive checklist, basically, to go through so that you know what is going to protect you properly.
Okay. So, yeah, that'd be awesome.
The second bit is then to have a health check, I've said. So you don't know what you don't know. What the next step would be is to look at what documents you've got in place. And you mentioned policies, so policies and procedures. Do you have employment agreements? Do you have a constitution in your company register, but not a shareholders agreement? So I'll go through those documents in a bit more detail too. And then you'd have a look and see what you've got in place against the list that I'm going to give you, and what you don't, and what might be important for your future growth. So that's the 3 under practice. And then under people, your first most important document would be making sure you've got your people documents in place for your team. So operations are delivered by people. You, as you grow, can't do everything. You do need people. So making sure you've got your team's arrangements properly documented, whether that's employment agreements or practitioner services agreements. If you're using contractors, making sure that those documents are watertight and going to protect you. They might need a restraint clause. They might need to make sure that you're clear that you're not paying superannuation for contractors, or you are, depending on the arrangement. And that's something that, and you could talk to your accountant about as well. The next one's organise the owners. And that is important if you run a business with a team of owners, or if you're just running it on your own. Do you have a will in place? What would happen to your team if you suddenly died? God forbid. But having that in place can help give you some peace of mind, or having a shareholders agreement or unit holders agreement, depending on the structure of your practice, or partnership agreement you mentioned if you're running as a partnership. Having that document in place can help prevent so many things going wrong. And we have things that you just, because we're lawyers, we see all the bad stuff. We see things where we had a client who's one of the partners ran off with the receptionist, and they moved into state, and no one could contact them, and they're still a shareholder in the practice, but they're not contributing day to day. So what do you do if you have a document that says what you can do? Even though one thing I found working with allied health people in particular is they don't want to think about what happens when things go wrong, which is funny because you guys are the ones who help prevent people to injure themselves. So you know that things can go wrong, but for some reason, hugely optimistic and thinking, I remember telling one physio, look, these are the things that are bad about this lease. Maybe we should go back and negotiate. And she said, look, I prefer not to think about those things. I'd rather think about things going well. And I was like, I get that.
Yeah, sorry, keep going. I've got a question for you.
I get that, but everything's not necessarily always going to be great. I mean, I'd love it to be, but
yeah, wouldn't we all? So I'm thinking, Sarah, about the clinic owners that, there's a couple of shareholders or a couple of partners, they get along really well. And I'm listening to this and I say, oh, yep, Sarah's right. We need a shareholders agreement. Previously, it's been on the back of a napkin and a handshake, but we probably should have a document. How does someone go about bringing that up with their partner, their business partner, and the business partner says, oh, she'll be right, mate. Don't worry about it. We're mates. We'll sort it out. Any tips for navigating that sort of a conversation?
Maybe it can be brought up in the, do you have a will? Yes, no, why not? Because some people don't want to face bad things happening.
Sure.
It's true. And then I might approach it from a valuation perspective. Like, what would happen if we got approached to be taken over? How would we value the practice? How would that work? I think, if something happened to me, then you might end up in business with my husband or wife or partner. I'm not sure that they'd be great at running this business. What do you think? If you have regular partner meetings, which you should be having, but you might not, that could be something just to bring up with that. I was talking to a GP the other day from rural Australia who works with 8 other doctors. And she was just like, how am I going to get this over the line with all of them? And for them, they want to expand and grow.
Right.
And one way they might do that is by bringing on other people in different locations. And so for them, having a base shareholders or unit holders agreement it's great to do it with 8, because in the future there might be more. And having that template to start for them was a good way for her to bring it up at a meeting.
Okay. No, that's awesome. Thank you. So we were touching on some of those owners' documents that we need to sort out. Was there anything else we missed there?
And no, that's the owner's documents. The next one's protecting your patients underneath the people block, which is you mentioned before a privacy policy, which all health providers do need, and making sure you've got maybe documents for data breach notification, which is mandatory. If you lose any patient information, you'll want to know what to do. Consent forms, we talk a lot about in Clinic Mastery. We talk about confidentiality agreements as well. So people have arrangements with their IT people and they see patient data and they aren't necessarily bound by anything unless you've got a confidentiality agreement in place. And the one we've prepared recently for a Clinic Mastery person requires that patient data absolutely never be shared. And the reason for that is you're not allowed to share it ever, so why should anyone else? And we do find we have some clinics we work with who have patients who are high profile, and that IT person might want to say that so-and-so politician or so-and-so TV personality visits this physio or this podiatrist or this psychologist, and we want to make sure that we're properly protecting you to make sure that that doesn't happen and impact you at some stage.
And I think, Sarah, I'm thinking about listeners and those that are involved in the NDIS or a scheme or a funding body that has really strict regulations beyond that of just APRA or the Privacy Act, those types of things. Not only do they need to have these policies, but they need to have it really well documented, accessible, ticked off and signed off. And so I think getting them in place is it's important, but it is a non-negotiable for clinics that are especially in the NDIS space, right? Yeah,
definitely. That's a really good point, and not something you can just copy from someone else. It needs to be personalised to your practice. And
that was my next question around privacy policies. That's one that we often see come up. I know a lot of the PMSs ask for it, that we, when we're using social media or on our websites, we should have privacy policies. Can I just download a template for free from Google, or does it need to be customised?
I think Google probably isn't a good place to get one for free. We offer them for
it's very diplomatic of you.
Gifts for Clinic Mastery people. So happy to send people a link for that, but making sure that it's customised, and if it's not something that you are familiar with, maybe not doing it yourself. Often also, I think professional associations have them as part of your membership. So looking into having it done through that.
Yeah, that's good. This might be digging into the weeds a little bit too much. Does a cookie policy fit within a privacy policy, or are they separate documents?
I think you can have it as one document.
Okay, that's good.
For your website privacy policy, yeah.
Yeah, that's it. I'm thinking about our listeners and members that are based in the UK or all through Europe, and how GDPR can play a big role.
Definitely.
Getting your privacy policy and your cookie policy in place for your website for those that are in the GDPR space. That's basically any European country or any clinic that works with clients that are based in Europe. It's so key when it comes to data handlers and data processors. Okay, so what other documents do we need?
And just on that, people who are doing telehealth internationally should be thinking about that as well. If they're based in Australia and they're working with clients in Europe, then that's a big red flag for a new privacy policy that someone in Europe would need to prepare for you, because it's different depending on the countries you're in.
Awesome. Thank you. What else do we need?
Well, now we're on to profit. So we're at the business end, the exciting end. Transacting with tenants as your first one. So if you've got a clinic that you rent rooms out in, making sure that there's an agreement for that you're getting something in writing that makes sure that you can increase the rent at certain points. We've had some people who have been renting rooms out, and the cost that they were renting them out just didn't cover the overheads for the clinic, and they were really trapped and stuck, and just it was creating a big hole in their P&L. So really thinking about how much you're charging people on the way in, and if you're providing reception services, making sure there's an element of payment for that as well. If you're sharing patient information, making sure that's all taken care of from a privacy and confidentiality point of view in the document as well.
Yeah, it's again one of those things that often ends up as a handshake agreement or between colleagues or friends. But having that documented in case people want to get out or you want to change the terms and providing the mechanisms for those is critical, right?
Exactly. And then one we find is incredibly interesting to people, promoting your practice in a legally compliant way can be pretty confusing for people who are APRA regulated, but it's really important. It's highly regulated, so understanding it. And if you're online, which most people are trying to market online now, understanding that framework can be what gives you the confidence to grow.
Okay, so what sort of documents help with that?
What sort of documents help with that? Making sure you have an advertising policy, social media policy, and a deep understanding of what APRA and your professional association require of you as well.
And I think an interesting point on that, Sarah, is that there is a lot of ambiguity and grey when it comes to APRA. And so, like you said, as always in law, it depends. Yeah, and it depends, and it sometimes takes some professional guidance to help give you some advice unique and specific to your situation, right?
Yeah, we've been working with a dentist recently who got a letter from APRA because they were doing their social media and advertising like any other ordinary business was, and it must have annoyed somebody. So if anyone ever gets a letter from APRA, I would say see a lawyer. It's not necessarily something you want to navigate yourself. That could be the red flag that you need to get these advertising and social media policy in place. They always give you a chance. All regulators are pretty reasonable to start with. So if you write and say, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry, I didn't know. And we've rectified everything that we were in breach for, they generally just say, okay. But if you don't, you can be fined up to $10,000 for each individual breach. And there's also a level of public shaming that goes along that we find that health professionals aren't that interested in. They want to look good in front of their peers as well as their patients, which is a self-regulating thing, I suppose.
Yeah, you're right. In my experience and understanding, and based on what you've said there, when it comes to regulatory bodies, APRA or professional associations, intent matters.
ASIC, there's lots of them out there.
Yeah, and how you approach these things matter. If you're blissfully unaware and go about apologising and doing the right thing, usually there's some grace available. They're somewhat lenient. They understand your intent. But if there's some maliciousness involved, you can end up in a bit of strife, right?
Or if you ignore it, if you put your head in your sand and think this is too hard, I don't know what to do. We also find having a letter come from a lawyer's letterhead, that shows you're extra seriously taking it seriously.
That's awesome. Can you just give us the overview of those three buckets of documents that we work through?
Finally, I think just making sure you've got the right insurance in place is a great idea, not just your professional indemnity insurance. If you're renting a room or if you're renting a whole building, making sure that you're protected if something happens. And been having some crazy weather events, so you just can't predict what's next. So I'll start with the practice documents. If you've incorporated a company, you'll have a company register. Usually your accountant will hold on to that. If you've got a discretionary or unit trust, there'll be trust deeds that go along with that. And then if you're in partnership with people, either a partnership agreement, a unit holders agreement, or a shareholders agreement, they're all under the practice documents. For the people documents, you might have contractor agreements, services agreements, employment agreements, confidentiality agreements, a privacy policy, data breach protocol and mandatory notification documents, which might be especially important if you are an NDIS provider, consent forms. Then we've got the owner's documents, the will and or testamentary trust. And then these agreements are people documents, but also practice documents, your shareholders agreement, unit holders agreement, and partnership agreement.
Mm-hmm.
And then your profit documents, your lease, or license to occupy. A license to occupy, if you have the head lease and you're renting rooms out, you would prefer a license to occupy than a sublease because it gives you as the head lessor more power over how you share the room. The next one's an intellectual property license. We've got some clients who intellectual property is really important in their practice, and so they move that intellectual property between legal entities in their structure, and so having that agreement is paramount. We talked about an advertising or social media policy, maybe a handbook on how we as a practice advertise in a legally compliant way, some examples of what to do and what not to do. Having an insurance policy review, and of course having an annual review process. There's no point in putting everything in place if you're just going to do it once and never review it. The law changes, your team changes, your practice changes as it grows, and having a process to make sure that you're up to date with everything once a year is a really good, I mean, you're not surprised to hear me say that as a lawyer. It's a really good practice.
Yeah. Look, I know what I'll be doing after this recording is scheduling the review. No, that's really helpful, Sarah. Thank you so much. And I know that clinic owners will find that really useful, really practical. And I'm sure the cogs will be turning now about how to prioritize what's next. And I guess a word of understanding for listeners is don't feel overwhelmed or burdened by this, that it's really a commitment to the process and the journey, one step at a time. When you're working with a great team over a period of weeks, months, or even years, we can get this sort of stuff nailed and handled in order of priority. Is that fair?
And that's why I listed the order of priority as well. So make sure your practice is protected first and foremost, or else you'll have nothing. Make sure your team and you and your patients are protected, and then look to the profit finally, because you can't grow without profit. You need it. It's not about being greedy. It's about making sure that you have a sustainable business and you're able to give back in the ways that you want to give back as well.
Awesome, Sarah. Thank you so much for your contribution there today. If people want to learn more, check you out, or get in touch, how should we go about that?
My website is ulegal.com.au. We're moving to ulegal.com, which is very exciting. There's a contact form on the website. So if you're interested in a free privacy policy for Australia, hit me up. Or if you want to get in touch and chat about anything else, you can contact me through the website.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And listeners, we'll make sure we link all that we've touched on today over at the show notes at clinicmastery.com/podcast. Look for the episode with Sarah Bartholomew's and you'll be able to find all of the links over there. Thank you, Sarah, for joining us today. It's been amazing.
Thanks for having me.
And listeners, thank you for joining us. And again, thank you for your reviews and ratings. We really appreciate you trusting us with your time and joining us for this episode of the podcast. And I can't wait to bring you another episode again really soon.
Thanks for tuning in to the Grow Your Clinic podcast. To find out more about past episodes or how we can help you, head to www.clinicmastery.com/podcast. And please remember to rate and review us on your podcast player of choice. See you on the next episode.